Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back. We now move into our parallel session, breakout session, each offering a deep dive into different aspects of the digital economy. My name is Fatma Al-Meheri, and I'm the Vice Chair of Adia Labs Operations Board, and I'll be your MC for the digital transformation of money and economy. In this session, our speakers will explore how AI, digital assets, and financial technologies are transforming money, markets, and monetary policy. Our first speaker is Professor Alex Lipton, Global Head of Quantitative Finance and a member of our advisory board at Adia Lab. Professor Lipton is an expert in quantitative finance, blockchain, and digital assets, with a unique ability to connect cutting-edge financial theory into practical applications. In his presentation today, Monetary Circuit Module and Cross-Border Payments, please welcome on stage Professor Alex Lipton. Thank you.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. It is nice to see so many familiar faces, some new faces, and I have to say that it is very hard to fill the shoes of previous speakers on this stage, and I will not really try to do this, but I will do do as best as I can, right? So essentially what I want to talk about is what we can use artificial intelligence for if we want to build a true versatile economic models. And these models ideally should be across the globe, across different economies, and so on and so forth, right? So, okay, this thing is falling. London Bridge is falling down. Anyway, so what I would like to talk about first is how money is created by individual banks, and then how it is created by the banking system, and then how we can capitalize on understanding how it is done in order to build a monetary circuit theory, and then what blockchain and distributed ledgers can do for this theory, how we can introduce digital currencies, stable coins, and digital trade coin, which Professor Pentland has already mentioned, and finally how we can close all this into understanding of supply chain dynamics and payments across. All right. So Ludwig von Mises already 100 years ago indicated that we will eventually arrive at the point when money will be just a commodity. And in some sense, he is right. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but you can understand what the gist of it, right? So because money has always been covered in mystery, right? So everybody thinks that they are an expert in this field because, most of the people at least have some money in their pocket, one way or the other, is in the physical representation or digitally. Not everybody, unfortunately, but most. And so, but at the same time, it's a super abstract concept. One of the most revolutionary ideas which came into being in the Sumer city-states about, I would say, 4,000 years ago, that sort of thing. And it's interesting that very little is left physical of Sumer, as opposite to Egypt, where we have pyramids and mummies and all that type of thing, right? So, but from a conceptual perspective, at least as far as I can understand, very little is left of Egypt, and enormous amount of body of knowledge from Sumer, and money is one of those, right? So whenever people talk about money, they naturally posit the following question: where is it coming from? So there's three theories. One is credit creation theory of banking. So money is essentially credit, and that idea can be traced back to Sumer. Then fractional reserve theory of banking, that is a kind of textbook explanation which does not hold water, but percolates textbooks, for the last 100 years, and finally, financial intermediation theory of banking. So I am a proponent, as you can probably see. There is a kind of bias in the order in which these theories are listed. I personally am an adept of the credit theory of money creation. So here we have some simple diagrams which show, the case of creation of money by one bank. So that's what we see here on the left. I will go through this step by step. And the other is theory of money creation by two banks. And, if basically you have a bank, it is characterized by its assets, its liabilities, and its capital, right? It is very important to understand that capital is an accounting balancing variable, so to speak. It does not mean that bank keeps its capital in gold and so on, even though it might not be a kind of super bad idea given the price of gold, but at any rate it would still be showing on the asset side, not on the liability side. So basically what happens is that if a certain company or individual comes to a bank and ask for a loan, bank does not really need to do much. They can say, okay, we will give you your loan, and so that would be on our liability side, and then at the same time the loan will appear on the asset side. And this way, this thing is a little increased by this individual loan. Then when time comes to pay, there might be two possibilities. Either this entity pays the money back with some small interest, and then the assets increase a little bit. Liabilities are the same as they were before, and capital increases. So that's a good way. That's kind of a way of doing banking well. However, it might also happen so that the entity defaults. When entity defaults, the asset side of the bank remains the same, liability is here, and so what happens is that the capital is reduced. So that is a bad situation. And so bank activity essentially balances capital versus assets, which kind of the size of capital define the size of possible assets. That's one regulatory variable. The other, which is not shown here but it's very important, is that how much money the bank actually keeps with central bank, because that tells you how much you can have here. So essentially it's a dynamic problem when a bank needs to balance a loan issuing activity with its ability to actually issue a loan. But at any rate, if there is such an ability, then essentially money is created and annihilated when it is loaned and when it is repaid. It's very interesting to see what happens if the money is not repaid. Then in a sense money enters into the system and never goes back, which would mean that essentially it's like counterfeiting currency. That's essentially what it is. That's why all the regulatory authorities and all the states are so much afraid of this type of situation, cascading defaults and so on, because that would result in debasement of the currency. Now, this is a very simple situation, as it was envisaged by many people since the 19th century, but in particular for Majid's benefit by this guy Werner, more recently, who did some experiments showing that this is how it works. So now if the person actually borrows from one bank but invests in the other bank, then the banks themselves need to do a complicated balancing act of restructuring their assets and liabilities in such a way that they have what they want. So in this process, the banks become interconnected, and that is the origin of the interconnectedness of the banking system. This happens at the level of individual banks, but it can also happen at the level of banking system as a whole. Okay, and again, I mean, there is no time to explain how exactly things go, but if the loan is repaid, then it's kind of repaid in turn, and everybody is very happy, and the capital of both banks involved increases a little bit, and that's the good thing. If not, then, you know, like if the first bank does not default, then the second bank will not lose much, but the first one will. And finally, if the first bank defaults in addition to its borrowers, then the second bank can default as well. So now the thing is that, as I said, yeah, and there is also one very important question. So one very important question is where this extra interest is coming from. Because, you know, if you borrow and you repay, so where would the interest come from? Interest comes from the next round of borrowing. So the monetary system, the way it is designed right now, cannot stop running. So the moment it stops running, the credit becomes tight, defaults cascade, and then the financial crisis happen. And we saw this many umpteen times. The most recent was the global financial crisis of 2008, 2009. The interesting thing about money is that because of this its creation out of thin air, it inevitably becomes inflationary. So we can see it basically the example of the decline and fall of the Roman denarius. So we can see that when the Roman Empire started, about the year, like a little before year 0, so the silver content of denarius was more or less 100%. You cannot have 100 because silver is soft, but almost 100. And then with different emperors, you can see that it was falling until there was nothing left. I would love to spend time on explaining how the bonus system and gold was created to finance the legion, but I don't have time. But it's an interesting story. You can ask me afterwards. But the same happened with money in our days. If you look at the sort of the decline of value of the US dollar, you can see that, you know, sadly, there is a certain reminiscence of the old days. Right? So, okay, with this idea that money can be created by banks, we can now see how it can expand itself to cover the whole economy, right? So we need to consider several sectors. You know, households, workers, firms, capitalists, banks, government, and central bank. In principle, it is enough to do just 3 sectors: households, firms, and banks. So banks, from what I already said, plays a central role. And why am I talking about this right now? Because I have been thinking about it back on and off for a better portion of a decade, is that AI now brings a completely different angle, completely different possibility of studying these models and making them actionable. That is, as you will see, there are various coefficients. So essentially, economy works as as a spring with a weight, that sort of thing. But you need to know the coefficient, the Hooke's coefficient, and that is what we can use AI to identify it. All right. So here is a typical sketch of monetary circuit. So we have central bank here, government, private banks, households, and firms. This is a snapshot, which actually shows the actual monetary flows on a particular year, sort of before the financial crisis. You can see how money moves from one sector to the other. Right? So in order to understand what is happening, we need to identify workers, rentiers, firms, banks, and then stocks and flows. This is of great importance, right? So the great Polish economist Kalecki used to say that economics is the science of confusing stocks and flows. So the last thing we want is to confuse stocks, which is what we have, and flows is how the stocks change. And then, of course, there is productivity, because we want to describe real economy as well. Population growth, prices, things like that. Then everything is characterized by bank. In my worldview, banking is central to the understanding of everything. Probably because I used to work in banks on and off for 25 years. Maybe that's kind of bias But anyway, so we have loans and deposits, and then finally firms actually do have physical assets. And as I said, it's a bit simplified because of course there are other physical assets like real estate, infrastructure, and so on and so forth. All right? So with this, we basically need to understand what share goes to workers and what share goes to firms, and how the unemployment kind of drives the whole thing. We will see that this is basically, in a nutshell, a theory of class struggle. We will see it in the next slide. But basically, we have financial and non-financial stocks, and then as I said, bank capital is a balancing variable, and if we calculate all in all what is in the economy, then we will see that, first of all, essentially all these stocks belong to renters, and what it is equal to, it's quite remarkable, it's the actual physical capital of firms. So everything else is built on top of physicality, which is embedded into the economy. All right? So now there is, as I said, a simple theory of class struggle. That is, how big is the share which is paid by to workers, and how it is related to the unemployment. And then, of course, as I said, because we actually have the real economy as well, we have some very simple dynamics of various productivity, population, and so on and so forth. Clearly, already at this stage, AI can do us a lot of good by actually improving these equations and their realism. And then, of course, what we have to calculate is production by firms, and which essentially is proportional to the physical capital. So this is a very important thing. So if we do all in all, so the classical Lotka-Volterra-Goodwin equation tell us that essentially it's a predator-prey relation between the share which goes to the workers and the unemployment. So that's what it is. So these equations are too simplistic. Even in the context of what I'm doing right now, these equations are too simplistic. So because they would describe clearly the situation when worker share is above 1 or unemployment below 0, that sort of thing. So we want to improve them. So which is something which I did in actual fact by adding stochasticity and regularization, and with this context everything becomes very reasonable. So we have cycles, so things go from a large portion going to workers and the low employment rate to the other way around, and so on and so forth. So, right? So basically now we can try to combine everything into production, consumption, investment. So this is, I keep pressing the other. So basically, this is production, which tells you what consumption by workers, what consumption by rentiers, and what is the investment by firms. And the point is that consumption by workers is essentially non-financial. It's very important to understand that workers essentially just get wages. So they do not truly participate in the financialization of the system. So that's what goes on to that. However, rentiers participate in a financial way. And as such, consumption is discretionary. And here is one possible equation which tells you that essentially they want to balance whatever they get to what they consume, but the kind of stochastic impact of that and also mean reversion. And again, I will quote Kalecki one more time. Not only he was a great economist, but also he had penchant for expressing his thoughts with extreme zest, which is not surprising because in his previous life he actually wrote papers, he was a journalist. So essentially what these equations say, that workers consume what they earn, renters earn what they consume. With this in mind, we can now calculate how firms invest in production, right? So, and basically find this equation which tells you the level of investment. Again, I don't want you to understand all these equations in great detail. All I'm trying to do is to outline how it can be done, all right? And so if we do all this, then we will see capacity utilization, firm's profit, etc., etc., etc. When finally we see how much is invested, you know, as proportion to what renters consume, what are the debt of the firm, what is the loan, and things like that. The deposits of the firm, the loans, etc. With this in mind, we can write all these equations. So this is what I call monetary circuit equations. And here is my call for action at this level, that we have a lot of coefficients. And these coefficients are really not known. And moreover, it's not even clear to me that some of the assumptions I made, linearity here and the simple relation there, are actually hold. So what would be super nice is to find a group of people who have time and enthusiasm and can help with actually populating the coefficients in this equation in such a way that we can actually describe the dynamics of one country and then the world economy. And these equations are closed and scale invariant. Production exactly equals consumption and investment. They're stochastic, and they also incorporate this class struggle Lotka-Volterra-Goodwin equations. So AI is instrumental in estimating the coefficients that make this equation a working horse of new economic thinking. If we manage to do this, then we can basically not only predict what's going to happen, but we can also try to control it one way or the other. All right? And so here is some solutions to these equations. They show different dynamics of, for example, employment and share of worker share of profits and things like that. All right? So now, with this in mind, we can also ask ourselves, is it possible to actually augment this equation with something which is becoming feasible in this day and age? That is tokenization and distributed ledgers. Why is it possible? Because if we manage to have distributed ledgers and things of that nature, then we can basically also maybe introduce some new means of payments. So rather than using bank money that I was describing at the beginning, perhaps we can also use something like TradeCoin, which Sandy Pentland, Thomas Harjon, and I have been so enamored for a number of years to improve the overall velocity of commerce and things of that nature. So basically, digital ledger technology, which you have heard about this umpteen times, it's a shared distributed ledger that allows you to record things in a transparent way. All right? So in the simplest way, if Alice wants to pay Bob something, and it's basically, again, we can see here, the kind of implicit biases. It's always Alice who pays Bob, never Bob who pays Alice. And the reason, of course, is that Alice starts with A, Bob starts with B, and that's how it works. So anyway, so this is a kind of how things are done. So she has a node, he has a node. There are kind of miners who maintain the integrity of the distributed ledger, notaries who record transactions, and in principle, all she needs to do is to say, I want to move money from my node to his node, and if she does have the money and she does have a private key to prove that she is a legal owner of that, then the transaction will be executed, right? And then, of course, the great advantage of all this, again, is that on top of this blockchain, you can also use smart contracts, which would allow you to automatically execute a variety of transactions, just greatly simplifying the operation of the whole system, all right? With this in mind, you can start using blockchain, distributed ledger, and smart contracts in order to build a digital avatars of physical money in the form of central bank digital cash, right? So there are several possibilities of how it can be done. One is when central bank does it directly. At this stage, there are no workable examples of this being done in that form. It is possible, but there are kind of some difficulties which are very difficult to address. For example, know your customer, anti-money laundering, and things like that. The other possibility is that central bank can outsource it to commercial banks, which would have to keep the CBDC producing facility kind of at arm's length compared to the other assets. It's very important, and this has been emphasized in Genius Act recently passed by the US Congress in conjunction not so much with CBDCs but with stable coins, which is a variation on the theme but done privately. For example, in the US, it is impossible to imagine that there would be CBDC. There are there are very strong vested interests which prevent it from happening, right? However, stable coins are all the rage in the US right now and in many other countries in the form, of course, of US dollar-based CBDCs, right? So, as I said, it's politically complicated and hence it is being outsourced to private initiative. There are different, different stable coins. One is the best known and the first, like USDT. This is Tether. So you can see that it suffered a little bit from instability, but down the road it became very stable. The other one, and this is an example of a stable coin, which is fully collateralized with actual deposits in banks and things of that nature, or maybe short-term government bonds. That's why in particular US is so interested in this angle, because it creates additional demand for the government paper, right? So the other possibility would be to try to over-collateralize it with other tokens like Bitcoin or Ethereum and things like that. So that's like was done by DAI, and again, it is working. It's basically not super efficient because the idea of high finance is to have under collateralization and trading on the margin and things like that, whilst here it's over collateralization. So it's at odds with the traditional thinking, but at least it works. And finally, there was a joke about, there is a joke of a currency which is sort of allegedly algorithmically stabilized. But of course, anyone who had to think about it just for a minute would appreciate that it is simply not possible to algorithmically stabilize. And indeed, this Luna Terra is one of many which failed dramatically, and clearly the inventor of this concoction is now kind of, I think, extradited to the United States for financial fraud, okay? Not surprising. Anyway, so that brings me to the idea of asset-backed cryptocurrency. And again, in addition to von Mises' quote, which is 100 years old, I would quote, Hao Qian, the former governor of the Bank of China, which is maybe 10 years old, because, they felt very strongly that this global financial crisis should not be let to fester and kind of be wasted. No crisis should be wasted, and the ideas of having asset-backed currencies is basically should be resurrected. And so basically, of course, the idea of anchoring value of currency in a basket of real asset is super old. For millennia, people use gold and silver. But basically now we can go further. We can use artificial intelligence combined with distributed ledgers in order to basically use other stuff like goods in transit and like in supply chain, goods going through the supply chain in order to create its own currency. That's what Sandy and I kind of dubbed as a digital trade coin. So one of the biggest possibilities is to use oil as collateral, and it's not surprising if you look at what's going on. Oil is the biggest collateral of them all. So in 1 year, it dwarfs anything else. And the interesting thing about oil is that, of course, it's burned. It cannot be stored and so on and so forth. And so basically, it's renewed all the time. And, that's one possibility, right? So to use big oil, and then this way you can create a digital trade coin. By trade coin, I mean a coin which does not really have a government backing behind it, but rather exists at kind of because of its own value. Again, I don't have time to explain how kind of gold coins circulating within the economy, they actually have less gold content than they value, because essentially government puts a stamp of approval and so on. While along the Silk Road, gold coins would not be valued by the governments, but solely of the content of what they represent, right? So as I said, we can develop a trade-oriented asset-backed digital currency, which could facilitate international trade and makes it as seamless as possible. And it can be used as a unit of account and a store of value, because whilst it is volatile, it's nowhere near as volatile as, say, Bitcoin, which can go up and down all the way. And with Bitcoin, my favorite saying is that Bitcoin has no value, hence it can have any price. The fact that something doesn't have value does not mean that it has zero price. In actual fact, what it really means is that it can have arbitrary price, okay? And so, if we were to do this, then of course we would have a variety of smart contracts, which I already mentioned, in order to facilitate, for example, foreign currency trading. So you can create an algorithmic liquidity pool and allow people to arbitrage it all they want. And with that, with some bid-ask spread, you can kind of exchange currencies automatically. These attempts have already been put into actual pilots, for example, in Singapore, which is basically a leader in this regard, but other countries, UAE in particular, kind of also picking up. So basically, and then finally, as I said, the supply chains are complex structures which bring goods from like beginning to the end. And as Majid correctly likes to point out, the final assembly in the factory is just a final sort of activity in the super long chain production chains. So we knew a very old supply chain coming from China all the way to Europe. So this is the Silk Road or Silk Roads. Basically, it also explains, an interesting thing. Why did Chinese bother to actually send silk and the porcelain and things like that to the West? Because they were not looking for anything coming from the West, except for the so-called, blood-sweating stallions, horses coming from this. And these horses would be in exchange for Iranian coins here, etc., 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 until it would come here, right? So that's kind of how supply chain operates in principle. That's how it looks in practice. And finally, the Ouroboros supply chain, that's my PIF project, is a supply chain which closes on itself. So say natural goods come from one country and travel all the way to another country, and then say goods coming from this country come back, and this way the supply chain closes. And I kind of outstate my welcome, so I will just draw my conclusions. So we can draw non-trivial conclusions by simply having a gedunking experiment of looking how money is created by one bank, what then happens when it's created by 2 banks, finally what happens when it is created by the system as a whole. The time is now to capitalize on this understanding in order to use AI to produce actionable insight. CBDCs and particular stable coins are very promising ideas. Asset-backed cryptocurrencies are even better. So automated market making can have quite an important impact on the market, not yet, but in the end. Digital twins, which means images and avatars of supply chain, can also be used in order to create this digital trade coin. And that brings me to the end. You can read some of the books which Sandy and I wrote and like others. So anyway, and I would like to thank various people, but there is no time to read their names, so they know whom I'm grateful to. And I'm also grateful to Fatima, so graciously giving me 2 more minutes. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. We'll open up for one question.
Can you give him the...
Do you think quantum computing poses any threat to distributed ledgers and cryptocurrency, cryptography in general?
It's a beautiful question. If you ask me as an individual, I would say no. If you ask me as a corporate man, I would say yes. So, but my view is it's a bit nuanced. So basically, what happens is that quantum computing, by using the so-called Shor algorithm, can in principle be used to factor very large numbers, which is one of the possible public-private key foundational layers. The other, of course, which actually is being used in distributed ledgers, are actually elliptic curves, which is a somewhat different technique, but relating to the same idea. So can quantum computer factor very large numbers? In theory, yes. In practice, people are still struggling with factoring the number 35. They do not want to admit that it has factors of 5 and 7 and struggle quite a lot to actually find this factor. It's very complicated. But again, it does not mean that this aspect cannot be improved considerably, and then maybe at some point it would become indeed a possibility. But there is another layer of protection which is extremely orthogonal to what quantum computers can do. That is, for example, in Bitcoin and all the modern blockchains, the actual public keys are not presented as such. They are presented in hash form, and unhashing is not really possible. That is not something which quantum computers can do. And there are no algorithms like Shor or anything to find the pre-image of a hashed image. So it's interesting that Bitcoin, which belonged to Satoshi Nakamoto himself, actually is in a form which can be attacked by quantum computers, because in the very old days, the public keys was printed the way they were, not in a hashed form. And so that's why people are saying that maybe Satoshi is moving his Bitcoins to new addresses just to avoid that risk. For those addresses, yes, there is a risk in actual fact. Not today, not tomorrow, but say in 2-3 years' time, yes, it is possible. It is possible. But for hashed addresses, modern addresses, I just don't see how it can be done. Okay?
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you very much.